Okay, so my name is Edward Kruk. I'm from the University of British Columbia, and the topic of my presentation is paternal alienation. And this is an area that I've been working on. My research on paternal alienation has actually spanned close to 4 decades, actually. And I've mainly examined the perspective of fathers who are the most adversely affected by paternal alienation. And I've also done a lot of research about strategies to overcome paternal alienation. I undertook my first research project in 1985, examining why so many fathers disengage from their children's lives after separation and divorce. It was reported that time by Frank Furstenberg in the States and others that fully half of non-custodial or non-resident fathers gradually lose all contact with their children over a period of time. And the deadbeat dad phenomenon was all the rage at that time, and it was assumed that these fathers are footloose and fancy-free after separation and quite okay with being relieved of their parental duties. My research uncovered a very different dynamic, which I termed at the time involuntary paternal disengagement. The term parental alienation hadn't yet been coined, but actually my cross-national research, it was a mixed method study of 80 fathers in the UK and also Canada, was the first to examine paternal alienation. I was really very interested in why so many fathers lose contact. It was just assumed they were deadbeat dads. And that study uncovered 4 key findings. First of all, that fathers suffer a grief reaction that contains all the major elements of bereavement, connected directly to the absence of their children, the loss of the father role, the constraints of the visiting relationship. Secondly, surprisingly, I found that fathers consider the adversarial legal system, which undermines rather than supports fathers in their continued role, basically removes them as active caregivers in their children's lives through primary residence decrees to mothers. They really attributed the legal system as the main problem, as responsible for their loss of contact, less emphasis on blaming mothers, actually. That was their perspective at that time. The third finding was that there's a marked discontinuity between pre- and post-divorce father-child relationships, meaning that it was the more highly involved and attached and influential fathers that were the most likely to lose contact. And it was the sort of the more traditional fathers who were the less involved fathers who were actually able to kind of work within the constraints of being visitors in their children's lives and actually had no problem maintaining contact, and found that in some cases seeing their kids on every second week basis, they were actually able to enhance their relationship. So it wasn't the highly involved and attached fathers that continued their contact. It was kind of the opposite, this discontinuity between. And the final finding that it was that involuntary paternal disengagement or parental alienation is the result of a combination of structural factors, the removal of fathers from their kids' lives via sole custody orders, and also fathers' own psychological response to the loss of their kids on a daily basis, the absence of their children, very debilitating, the loss of the father role, the constraints of the visiting relationship. So that research was published in 1990 in book form as Divorce and Disengagement. More recently, I undertook a replication of that research, which was also a mixed method study of 80 fathers, which has also been published in a book form under the title Divorced Fathers, Children's Needs and Parental Responsibilities. My main finding there was that the situation for fathers has actually gotten significantly worse. They now manifest a more pronounced reaction of not only kind of bereavement, but really quite pronounced post-traumatic stress, as they now have, fathers are now in the intervening 30 years playing a much more active role in their children's lives and in child caregiving. and they're so acutely aware of the consequences of their absence in their children's lives after separation. So advance, please. So my presentation today will look at mainly at the implications of my research over the years on divorced dads. I'll talk about parental alienation as a form of family violence directed toward divorced fathers in the context of child custody disputes. I'll look at paternal alienation as a form of emotional child abuse linked to other forms of child maltreatment. Thirdly, I'll look at the limitations of a strictly rights-based approach to preventing and addressing paternal alienation. My findings point to the need for more of a child-focused responsibility to needs orientation, in which the notion of paternal responsibilities takes precedence over the notion of rights. And finally, I'll present a four-pillar approach to addressing parental or paternal alienation. Addressing alienation requires a multifaceted approach. Paternal alienation is a very complex social problem created largely by adversarial legal systems of family separation, and our solutions need to be both individual and systemic, both micro and macro interventions. Slide. Paternal alienation is both a form of family violence directed toward divorced fathers in the context of child custody disputes and a form of emotional child abuse linked to other forms of child maltreatment. It consists of an unjustified rejection of a father by the child, in which the child's views of the father are exclusively negative, to the point that the father is demonized and seen as evil. It results from a campaign of denigration by an alienating mother, in which the child allies with the mother, and the negative impacts on both the child and the father are profound. It's a global problem that has a devastating impact on the lives of millions of fathers and children worldwide. Next slide, please. So there are 5 factors in the identification of paternal alienation. And this is drawing from on the work of Amy Baker and others. The first factor is that the child refuses contact and expresses either hatred or complete indifference toward the targeted, rejected fathers. There's no ambivalence on the part of the child. Secondly, there was a prior positive relationship between the child and the now rejected father. Thirdly, there's an absence of abuse or neglect or deficient parenting by the father. Fourth, there are multiple alienating behaviors by the mother, from demonizing to instilling fear of the father to refusing all contact. And finally, there are also behavioral manifestations in the child: denigration of the targeted father, weak or untrue rationalizations, an absence of guilt, borrowed scenarios from the alienating mother, false statements based on false beliefs, based on false memories. These all 5 factors have to be in place for us to consider a situation as paternal alienation. So paternal alienation is a form of gendered family violence. Although mothers and fathers are equally capable of being perpetrators or targets of alienation, parental alienation, in the present legal context of child custody determination, significantly more fathers are affected and are victims of alienation. Alienated fathers live with anxiety, depression, and helplessness, as well as feelings of victimization by the other parent, the child, and the myriad systems with which they become involved that aren't responsive to their needs and are often quite hostile: legal, mental health, school systems. We know from one study that the highest levels of depression occur among fathers who have a child under age 18 with whom they're no longer living or actively involved. We have another study that identifies a suicide, quote, a suicide epidemic among non-resident alienated parents, especially fathers. My own research over 30 years ago found that fathers who lost contact with their kids following a divorce suffered a grief reaction containing all the elements of a bereavement. And in the follow-up study 30 years later, fathers are now manifesting a much more pronounced reaction of post-traumatic stress. And I'd refer you to an article published recently in Psychological Bulletin by Jennifer Harman and myself, entitled Parental Alienating Behaviors, an Unacknowledged Form of Family Violence. Both practitioners, academics, and specialists in the field of alienation and also the psychological community as a whole, because Psychological Bulletin is the kind of journal of the American Psychological Association, are now beginning to recognize parental and paternal alienation as a form of family violence. Next slide. It's now well documented that paternal alienation represents a serious form of victimization and abuse of fathers. And it's a form of both individual and collective or systemic abuse. And these three quotes, I think, kind of capture the essence of what paternal alienation is all about and its effects on fathers. So Richard Gardner, many years ago, described it as the continuous heartache is similar to a living death. Now, Bob Geldof, in writing about paternal alienation, refers to the idea of father-child relations as almost something that is just so suspect. It's the love that dares not speak its name. And I've described it as a primal wound. More than anything, it occasions a profound spiritual distress for men and fathers. Parental alienation is also a form of child abuse. And there are two features in the definition of child abuse or maltreatment that make it child abuse. First of all, its occurrence is attributed to human agency. And secondly, it's a significant form of harm to children. And how is paternal alienation a form of child abuse? Well, it contains both of these elements. It involves a set of abusive strategies on the part of the mother to foster the child's rejection of the father, whereby children are manipulated by the mother to hate the father, reinforced by a legal system which effectively removes fathers from the routine lives of their children. So the abuse is both individual and collective. And its negative effects are serious and debilitating to children. For the child, parental alienation is a significant mental disturbance based on a false belief that the alienated father is a dangerous and unworthy parent. The effects of parental alienation on children, if we could advance. And I'm running out of time very quickly, so I won't go into these, but I'll just note them. Poor self-esteem, depression, and self-hatred, disrupted social emotional development, withdrawal, isolation, social anxiety, low self-sufficiency, lack of autonomy, dependence on the parent, academic struggles and failure to reach academic and employment potential, and poor impulse control, struggles with addiction and self-harm. So let's look at remedies to paternal alienation as a form of family violence. How do we ameliorate its effects and try to rid ourselves of this as a social problem? First of all, I believe we have to abandon the notion of positioning fathers' rights as the forefront of our efforts. I've kind of listed some of the limitations of a strictly rights-based approach to addressing parental alienation. The language of rights is a language of privilege and entitlement, focusing on getting what we want rather than deeper interests. Rights are asserted in a tone of contention, which relies on force in the background. It's based on measure and apportionment. It involves taking away from you to give to me. It inhibits compassion, cooperation, and collaboration. It imposes a moral mediocrity. And the more concerned we are about rights, the less we're focused on our responsibilities and needs of children and responsibility to those needs. And finally, it blunts our pursuit of justice, our capacity to care, to reduce harms, and to attend to others' needs. So the alternative I propose is a child-focused, evidence-based responsibility to children's needs approach to addressing paternal alienation. We now, the foundation of family law today is the idea of the best interest of the child, which people have described as an empty vessel into which adult prejudices are poured. It was actually Hillary Clinton who was a family lawyer, and that is her kind of description of the current regime. That's because it's based on what adults think is best for children, and it usually involves pitting fathers' rights against women's rights. We need to get rid of ourselves of such an adversarial approach. A child-focused approach is what we need, based on what children themselves report as most important to them. A responsibility to needs approach to determining children's living arrangements after separation involves identifying parental responsibilities to children's essential needs. And basically two of those are the need for the continuation of meaningful attachments and relationships with both parents and being shielded from family violence and abuse. So now I come to the main point of my presentation, if I may. Okay. Next slide, please. So a four-pillar approach to addressing paternal alienation. A multifaceted approach. Our solutions need to be individual and systemic. So this involves four pillars of intervention. Recognition of paternal alienation as a specific form of family violence, warranting a criminal justice response. Secondly, recognition of paternal alienation as a specific form of child abuse, warranting a child protection response. Thirdly, prevention, which involves establishing equal shared parenting as the foundation of family law. And finally, treatment, including specialized practice with targeted fathers and children and father-child reunification programs. And this four-pillar approach has been published in book form as The Equal Parent Presumption by McGill Queen's University Press. So I don't have time clearly to get into each of these. So let's skip right to the end slide, because I could talk about each of these four pillars in a little more detail, but I'll leave you with this final thought. This is actually my mantra when it comes to addressing paternal alienation as a form of family violence. It's the responsibility of social institutions to support rather than undermine parents in the fulfillment of their parental responsibilities. Thank you.